Psalm 78, Part 2 of The Treasury of David. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. The Treasury of David, Volume 3, by Charles Spurgeon. Psalm 78, Part 2. Verses 42 to 53. They remembered not his hand, nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy, how he had wrought his signs in Egypt, and his wonders in the field of Zoan, and had turned their rivers into blood, and their floods, that they could not drink. He sent divers sorts of flies among them, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. He gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labours unto the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore trees with frost. He gave up their cattle also to the hail, and their flocks to hot thunderbolts. He cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble, by sending evil angels among them. He made a way to his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence. And smote all the firstborn of Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham. But made his own people to go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them on safely, so that they feared not. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies. Verse 42. They remembered not his hand. Yet it must have been difficult to forget it. Such displays of divine power as those which smote Egypt with astonishment, it must have needed some more than usual effort to blot from the tablets of memory. It is probably meant that they practically rather than actually forgot. He who forgets the natural returns of gratitude may justly be charged with not remembering the obligation. Nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy. The day itself was erased from their calendar, so far as any due result from it or return for it. Strange is the faculty of memory in its oblivions as well as its records. Sin perverts man's powers, makes them forceful only in wrong directions, and practically dead for righteous ends. Verse 43. How he had wrought his signs in Egypt. The plagues were ensigns of Jehovah's presence and proof of his hatred of idols. These instructive acts of power were wrought in the open view of all, as signals are set up to be observed by those far and near. And his wonders in the field of Zoan. In the whole land were miracles wrought, not in cities alone, but in the broad territory, in the most select and ancient regions of the proud nation. This the Israelites ought not to have forgotten, for they were the favoured people for whom these memorable deeds were wrought. Verse 44. And had turned their rivers into blood. The waters had been made the means of the destruction of Israel's newborn infants, and now they do as it were betray the crime, they blush for it, they avenge it on the murderers. The Nile was the vitality of Egypt, its true lifeblood. But at God's command it became a flowing curse. Every drop of it was a horror, poison to drink, and terror to gaze on. Sometimes he has allowed men, who were his rod, to make rivers crimson with gore, and this is a severe judgment. But the event now before us was more mysterious, more general, more complete, and must, therefore, have been a plague of the first magnitude. And their floods that they could not drink. Lesser streams partook in the curse. Reservoirs and canals felt the evil. God does nothing by halves. All Egypt boasted of the sweet waters of their river, but they were made to loathe it more than they had ever loved it. Our mercies may soon become our miseries if the Lord shall deal with us in his wrath. Verse 45. He sent divers sorts of flies among them, which devoured them. Small creatures become great tormentors. When they swarm they can sting a man till they threaten to eat him up. In this case, various orders of insects fought under the same banner. Lice and beetles, gnats and hornets, wasps and gadflies, dashed forward in fierce battalions and worried the sinners of Egypt without mercy. The tiniest plagues are the greatest. What sword or spear could fight with these innumerable bands? Vain were the monarch's armour and robes of majesty. The little cannibals were no more lenient towards royal flesh than any other. It had the same blood in it, and the same sin upon it. How great is that God who thus by the minute can crush the magnificent. And frogs which destroyed them. These creatures swarmed everywhere when they were alive, until the people felt ready to die at the sight. And when the reptiles died, the heaps of their bodies made the land to stink so foully that a pestilence was imminent. Thus not only did earth and air send forth armies of horrible life, but the water also added its legions of loathsomeness. It seemed as if the Nile was first made nauseous and then caused to leave its bed altogether, crawling and leaping in the form of frogs. Those who contend with the Almighty little know what arrows are in his quiver. Surprising sin shall be visited with surprising punishment. Verse 46. He gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labour unto the locust. Different sorts of devourers ate up every green herb and tree. What one would not eat, another did. What they expected from the natural fertility of the soil, and what they looked for from their own toil, they saw devoured before their eyes by an insatiable multitude against whose depredations no defence could be found. Observe in the text that the Lord did it all. He sent, he gave, he destroyed, he gave up, etc. Whatever the second agent may be, the direct hand of the Lord is in every national visitation. Verse 47. He destroyed their vines with hail. No more shall thy butler press the clusters into thy cup, O Pharaoh. The young fruit-bearing shoots were broken off, the vintage failed. And their sycamore trees with frost. Frost was not usual, but Jehovah regards no laws of nature when men regard not his moral laws. The sycamore fig was perhaps more the fruit of the many than was the vine, therefore this judgment was meant to smite the poor, while the former fell most heavily upon the rich. Mark how the heavens obey their Lord and yield their stores of hail, and note how the fickle weather is equally subservient to the divine will. Verse 48. He gave up their cattle also to the hail. What hail it must have been to have force enough to batter down bullocks and other great beasts. God usually protects animals from such destruction, but here he withdrew his safeguards and gave them up. May the Lord never give us up. Some read shut up, and the idea of being abandoned to destructive influences is then before us in another shape. And their flocks to hot thunderbolts. Fire was mingled with the hail. The fire ran along upon the ground. It smote the smaller cattle. What a storm it must have been. Its effects were terrible enough upon plants, but to see the poor dumb creatures stricken must have been heartbreaking. Adamantine was the heart which quailed not under such plagues as these. Harder than adamant those hearts which in after years forgot all that the Lord had done, and broke off from their allegiance to him. Verse 49. He cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble. His last arrow was the sharpest. He reserved the strong wine of his indignation to the last. Note how the psalmist piles up the words, and well he might, for blow followed blow, each one more staggering than its predecessor, and then the crushing stroke was reserved for the end. By sending evil angels among them. Messengers of evil entered into their houses at midnight, and smote the dearest objects of their love. The angels were evil to them, though good enough in themselves. Those who to the heirs of salvation are ministers of grace, are to the heirs of wrath executioners of judgment. When God sends angels, they are sure to come, and if he bids them slay, they will not spare. See how sin sets all the powers of heaven in array against man. He has no friend left in the universe when God is his enemy. Verse 50. He made a way to his anger. Coming to the point with them by slow degrees, assailing their outworks first by destroying their property, and then coming in upon their persons as though an open breach in the walls. He broke down all the comforts of their life, and then advanced against their life itself. Nothing could stand in his way. He cleared a space in which to do execution upon his adversaries. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence. In their soul was the origin of sin, and he followed it to its source and smote it there. A fierce disease filled the land with countless funerals. Jehovah dealt out myriads of blows, and multitudes of spirits failed before him. Verse 51. And smote all the firstborn of Egypt. No exceptions were made. The monarch bewailed his heir, as did the menial at the mill. They smote the Lord's firstborn, even Israel, and he smites theirs. The chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham. Swinging his scythe over the field, death topped off the highest flowers. The tents of Ham knew each one its own peculiar sorrow, and were made to sympathize with the sorrows which had been ruthlessly inflicted upon the habitations of Israel. Thus curses come home to roost. Oppressors are repaid in their own coin without the discount of a penny. Verse 52. But made his own people to go forth like sheep. The contrast is striking, and ought never to have been forgotten by the people. The wolves were slain in heaps, the sheep were carefully gathered and triumphantly delivered. The tables were turned, and the poor serfs became the honored people, while their oppressors were humbled before them. Israel went out in a compact body like a flock. They were defenseless in themselves as sheep, but they were safe under their great shepherd. They left Egypt as easily as a flock leaves one pasture for another, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. Knowing nothing of the way by their own understanding or experience, they were, nevertheless, rightly directed, for the all-wise God knew every spot of the wilderness. To the sea, through the sea, and from the sea, the Lord led his chosen, while their former taskmasters were too cowed in spirit and broken in power to dare to molest them. Verse 53. And he led them on safely, so that they feared not. After the first little alarm, natural enough when they found themselves pursued by their old taskmasters, they plucked up courage and ventured boldly into the sea, and afterwards into the desert where no man dwelt. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies. They were gone, gone forever, never to disturb the fugitives again. That tremendous blow effectually defended the tribes for 40 years from any further attempt to drive them back. Egypt found the stone too heavy and was glad to let it alone. Let the Lord be praised who thus effectually freed his elect nation. What a grand narrative we have been considering. Well might the mightiest master of sacred song select Israel in Egypt as a choice theme for his genius, and well may every believing mind linger over every item of the amazing transaction. The marvel is that the favoured nation should live as if unmindful of it all, and yet such is human nature. Alas, poor man, rather alas, base heart. We now, after a pause, follow again the chain of events, the narration of which had been interrupted by a retrospect, and we find Israel entering into the promised land, there to repeat her follies and enlarge her crimes. Verses 54 to 66. And he brought them to the border of his sanctuary, even to this mountain, which his right hand had purchased. He cast out the heathen also before them, and divided them an inheritance by line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. Yet they tempted and provoked the Most High God, and kept not his testimonies, but turned back, and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. For they provoked him to anger with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. When God heard this, he was wroth, and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory into the enemy's hand. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awaked as one out of sleep, and like a mighty man that shouteth by reason of wine. And he smote his enemies in the hinder parts, he put them to a perpetual reproach. Verse 54. And he brought them to the border of his sanctuary. He conducted them to the frontier of the Holy Land, where he intended the tabernacle to become the permanent symbol of his abode among his people. He did not leave them halfway upon their journey to their heritage. His power and wisdom preserved the nation till the palm trees of Jericho were within sight on the other side of the river. Even to this mountain which his right hand had purchased. Nor did he leave them then, but still conducted them till they were in the region round about Zion, which was to be the central seat of his worship. This the Lord had purchased in type of old by the sacrifice of Isaac, a fit symbol of the great sacrifice which was in due season to be presented there. That mountain was also redeemed by power, when the Lord's right hand enabled his valiant men to smite the Jebusites and take the sacred hill from the insulting Canaanite. Thus shall the elect of God enjoy the sure protection of the Lord of hosts, even to the border land of death, and through the river, up to the hill of the Lord of glory. The purchased people shall safely reach the purchased inheritance. Verse 55. He cast out the heathen also before them, or he drove out the nations. Not only were armies routed, but whole peoples displaced. The iniquity of the Canaanites was full. Their vices made them rot above ground. Therefore the land ate up its inhabitants. The hornets vexed them, the pestilence destroyed them, and the sword of the tribes completed the execution to which the justice of long provoked heaven had at length appointed them. The Lord was the true conqueror of Canaan. He cast out the nations as men cast out filth from their habitations. He uprooted them as noxious weeds are extirpated by the husbandman, and divided them an inheritance by line. He divided the land of the nations among the tribes by lot and measure, assigning Hivite, Perizzite, and Jebusite territory to Simon, Judah, or Ephraim, as the case might be. Among those condemned nations were not only giants in stature, but also giants in crime. Those monsters of iniquity had too long defiled the earth. It was time that they should no more indulge the unnatural crimes for which they were infamous. They were, therefore, doomed to forfeit life and lands by the hands of the tribes of Israel. The distribution of the forfeited country was made by divine appointment. It was no scramble, but a judicial apportionment of lands which had fallen to the crown by the attainder of the former holders, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. The favoured people entered upon a furnished house. They found the larder supplied, for they fed upon the old corn of the land, and the dwellings were already builded in which they could dwell. Thus does another race often enter into the lot of a former people, and it is sad indeed when the change which judgment decrees does not turn out to be much for the better, because the incomers inherit the evils as well as the goods of the ejected. Such a case of judicial visitation ought to have had a salutary influence upon the tribes, but alas, they were incorrigible, and would not learn even from examples so near at home and so terribly suggestive. Verse 56, yet they tempted and provoked the Most High God. Change of condition had not altered their manners. They left their nomadic habits, but not their tendencies to wander from their God. Though every divine promise had been fulfilled to the letter, and the land flowing with milk and honey was actually their own, yet they tried the Lord again with unbelief, and provoked him with other sins. He is not only high and glorious, but most high, yea, the most high, the only being who deserves to be so highly had in honour. Yet, instead of honouring him, Israel grieved him with rebellion, and kept not his testimonies. They were true to nothing but hereditary treachery, steadfast in nothing but in falsehood. They knew his truth and forgot it, his will and disobeyed it, his grace and perverted it to an occasion for greater transgression. Reader, dost thou need a looking-glass? See, here is one which suits the present expositor well. Does it not also reflect thine image? Verse 57, but turned back. Turned over the old leaf, repeated the same offences, started aside like an ill-made bow, were false and faithless to their best promises, and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers, proving themselves legitimate by manifesting the treachery of their sires. They were a new generation, but not a new nation, another race, yet not another. Evil propensities are transmitted, the birth follows the progenitor, the wild ass breeds wild asses, the children of the raven fly to the carrion. Human nature does not improve. The new editions contain all the errata of the first, and sometimes fresh errors are imported. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, which not only fails to send the arrow towards the mark in a direct line, but springs back to the archer's hurt, and perhaps sends the shaft among his friends to their serious jeopardy. Israel boasted of the bow as the national weapon. They sang the song of the bow, and hence a deceitful bow is made to be the type and symbol of their own unsteadfastness. God can make men's glory the very ensign of their shame. He draws a bar sinister across the escutcheon of traitors. Verse 58, for they provoked him to anger with their high places. This was their first error, will worship or the worship of God, otherwise than according to his command. Many think lightly of this, but indeed it is no mean sin, and its tendencies to further offence are very powerful. The Lord would have his holy place remain as the only spot for sacrifice, and Israel, in wilful rebellion, no doubt glossed over by the plea of great devotion, determined to have many altars upon many hills. If they might have but one God, they insisted upon it that they would not be restricted to one sacred place of sacrifice. How much of the worship of the present day is neither more nor less than sheer will worship? Nobody dare plead a divine appointment for a tithe of the offices, festivals, ceremonies, and observances of certain churches. Doubtless God, so far from being honoured by worship which he has not commanded, is greatly angered by it, and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. This was but one more step. They manufactured symbols of the invisible God, for they lusted after something tangible and visible to which they could show reverence. This also is the crying sin of modern times. Do we not hear and see superstition abounding? Images, pictures, crucifixes, and a host of visible things are had in religious honour, and worst of all, men nowadays worship what they eat, and call that a God which passes into their belly, and thence to baser places still. Surely the Lord is very patient, or he would visit the earth for this worst and basest of idolatry. He is a jealous God, and abhors to see himself dishonoured by any form of representation which can come from man's hands. Verse 59. When God heard this, he was wroth. The mere report of it filled him with indignation. He could not bear it. He was incensed to the uttermost, and most justly so. And greatly abhorred Israel. He cast his idolatrous people from his favour, and left them to themselves and their own devices. How could he have fellowship with idols? What concord hath Christ with Belial? Sin is in itself so offensive that it makes the sinner offensive too. Idols of any sort are highly abhorrent to God, and we must see to it that we keep ourselves from them through divine grace, for rest assured, idolatry is not consistent with true grace in the heart. If Dagon sit aloft in any soul, the ark of God is not there. Where the Lord dwells, no image of jealousy will be tolerated. A visible church will soon become a visible curse if idols be set up in it, and then the pruning knife will remove it as a dead branch from the vine. Note that God did not utterly cast away his people Israel even when he greatly abhorred them, for he returned in mercy to them, so the subsequent verses tell us. So now the seed of Abraham, though for a while under heavy cloud, will be gathered yet again, for the covenant of salt shall not be broken. As for the spiritual seed, the Lord hath not despised nor abhorred them. They are his peculiar treasure, and lie forever near his heart. Verse 60. So that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men. His glory would no more reveal itself there. He left Shiloh to become a complete ruin. At the door of that tent shameless sin had been perpetrated, and around it idols had been adored, and therefore the glory departed, and Ichabod was sounded as a word of dread concerning Shiloh and the tribe of Ephraim. Thus may the candlestick be removed, though the candle is not quenched. Erring churches become apostate, but a true church still remains. If Shiloh be profaned, Zion is consecrated. Yet is it ever a solemn caution to all the assemblies of the saints, admonishing them to walk humbly with their God, when we read such words as those of the prophet Jeremiah in his 7th chapter. Trust ye not in lying words, saying, The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. Go ye now unto my place which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. Let us take heed, lest as the ark never returned to Shiloh after its capture by the Philistines, so the gospel may be taken from us in judgment, never to be restored to the same church again. Verse 61. And delivered his strength into captivity. The ark was captured by the Philistines in battle, only because the Lord, for the punishment of Israel, chose to deliver it into their hands, otherwise they could have no power at all against it. The token of the divine presence is here poetically called his strength, and indeed the presence of the Lord is his strength among his people. It was a black day when a mercy seat was removed, when the cherubim took flight and Israel's palladium was carried away. And his glory into the enemy's hand. The ark was the place for the revealed glory of God, and his enemies exulted greatly when they bore it away to their own cities. Nothing could more clearly have shown the divine displeasure. It seemed to say that Jehovah would sooner dwell among his avowed adversaries than among so false a people as Israel. He would sooner bear the insults of Philistia than the treacheries of Ephraim. This was a fearful downfall for the favoured nation, and it was followed by dire judgments of most appalling nature. When God is gone, all is gone. No calamity can equal the withdrawal of the divine presence from a people. O Israel, how art thou brought low! Who shall help thee now that thy God has left thee? Verse 62. He gave his people over also unto the sword. They fell in battle because they were no longer aided by the divine strength. Sharp was the sword, but sharper still the cause of its being unsheathed. And it was wrought with his inheritance. They were his still, and twice in this verse they are called so, yet his regard for them did not prevent his chastising them, even with the rod of steel. Where the love is most fervent, the jealousy is most cruel. Sin cannot be tolerated in those who are a people near unto God. Verse 63. The fire consumed their young men. As fire slew Nadab and Abihu, literally, so the fire of divine wrath fell on the sons of Eli, who defiled the sanctuary of the Lord, and a like fire, in form of war, consumed the flower of the people. And their maidens were not given to marriage. No nuptial hymns were sung, the bride lacked her bridegroom, the edge of the sword had cut the bands of their espousals, and left unmarried those who else had been extolled in hymns of congratulation. Thus Israel was brought very low. She could not find husbands for her maids, and therefore her state was not replenished. No young children clustered around parental knees. The nation had failed in its solemn task of instructing the young in the fear of Jehovah, and it was a fitting judgment that the very production of a posterity should be endangered. Verse 64. Their priests fell by the sword. Hophni and Phinehas were slain. They were among the chief in sin, and therefore they perished with the rest. Priesthood is no shelter for transgressors. The jeweled breastplate cannot turn aside the arrows of judgment. And their widows made no lamentation. Their private griefs were swallowed up in the greater national agony, because the ark of God was taken. As the maidens had no heart for the marriage song, so the widows had no spirit, even to utter the funeral wail. The dead were buried too often and too hurriedly to allow the usual rites of lamentation. This was the lowest depth. From this point things will take a gracious turn. Verse 65. The Lord awaked as one out of sleep. Justly inactive, he had suffered the enemy to triumph, his ark to be captured, and his people to be slain. But now he arouses himself. His heart is full of pity for his chosen, and anger against the insulting foe. Woe to thee, O Philistia! Now shalt thou feel the weight of his right hand. Waking and putting forth strength like a man who had taken a refreshing draught, the Lord is said to be like a mighty man that shouteth by reason of wine. Strong and full of energy, the Lord dashed upon his foes. He made them stagger beneath his blows. His ark from city to city went as an avenger rather than as a trophy, and in every place the false gods fell helplessly before it. Verse 66. He smote his enemies in the hinder parts. The Emerods rendered them ridiculous, and their numerous defeats made them yet more so. They fled, but were overtaken and wounded in the back to their eternal disgrace. He put them to a perpetual reproach. Orientals are not very refined, and we can well believe that the Hemorrhoids were the subject of many a taunt against the Philistines, as also were their frequent defeats by Israel, until at last they were crushed under, never to exist again as a distinct nation. Verses 67 to 72. Moreover, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph, and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like high places, like the earth which he hath established for ever. He chose David also his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes great with young, he brought him to feed Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. Verse 67. Moreover, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph. God had honored Ephraim, for to that tribe belonged Joshua the great conqueror, and Gideon the great judge, and within its borders was Shiloh, the place of the ark and the sanctuary. But now the Lord would change all this and set up other rulers. He would no longer leave matters to the leadership of Ephraim, since that tribe had been tried and found wanting. And chose not the tribe of Ephraim. Sin had been found in them, falling instability, and therefore they were set aside as unfit to lead. Verse 68. but chose the tribe of Judah. To give the nation another trial, this tribe was elected to supremacy. This was according to Jacob's dying prophecy. Our Lord sprang out of Judah, and he it is whom his brethren shall praise. The Mount Zion which he loved. The tabernacle and ark were removed to Zion during the reign of David. No honor was left to the wayward Ephraimites. Hard by this mountain the father of the faithful had offered up his only son, and there in future days the great gatherings of his chosen seed would be, and therefore Zion is said to be lovely unto God. Verse 69. And he built his sanctuary like high palaces. The tabernacle was placed on high, literally and spiritually. It was as a mountain of beauty. True religion was exalted in the land. For sanctity it was a temple, for majesty it was a palace. Like the earth which he hath established for ever. Stability as well as stateliness were seen in the temple, and so also in the church of God. The prophet saw both in vision. Verse 70. He chose David also his servant. It was an election of a sovereignly gracious kind, and it operated practically by making the chosen man a willing servant of the Lord. He was not chosen because he was a servant, but in order that he might be so. David always esteemed it to be a high honor that he was both elect of God and a servant of God. And took him from the sheepfolds. A shepherd of sheep he had been, and this was a fit school for a shepherd of men. Lowliness of occupation will debar no man from such honours as the Lord's election confers. The Lord seeth not as man seeth. He delights to bless those who are of low estate. Verse 71. From following the ewes, great with young, he brought him to feed Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. Exercising the care and art of those who watch for the young lambs, David followed the ewes in their wanderings. The tenderness and patience thus acquired would tend to the development of characteristics most becoming in a king. To the man thus prepared, the office and dignity which God had appointed for him came in due season, and he was enabled worthily to wear them. It is wonderful how often divine wisdom so arranges the early and obscure portion of a choice life, so as to make it a preparatory school for a more active and noble future. Verse 72. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart. David was upright before God and never swerved in heart from the obedient worship of Jehovah. Whatever faults he had, he was unfeignedly sincere in his allegiance to Israel's superior king. He shepherded for God with honest heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. He was a sagacious ruler, and the psalmist magnifies the Lord for having appointed him. Under David, the Jewish kingdom first rose to an honorable position among the nations, and exercised an influence over its neighbors. In closing the psalm, which has described the various conditions of the chosen nation, we are glad to end so peacefully, with all noise of tumult or of sinful rites hushed into silence. After a long voyage over a stormy sea, the ark of the Jewish state rested on its Ararat, beneath a wise and gentle reign, to be wafted no more hither and thither by floods and gales. The psalmist had all along intended to make this his last stanza, and we too may be content to finish all our songs of love with the reign of the Lord's anointed. Only we may eagerly inquire, when will it come? When shall we end these desert roamings, these rebellions and chastenings, and enter into the rest of a settled kingdom, with the Lord Jesus reigning as the Prince of the house of David? Thus have we ended this lengthy parable. May we in our life parable have less of sin and as much of grace as are displayed in Israel's history, and may we close it under the safe guidance of that great shepherd of the sheep. Amen. End of Psalm 78, and end of The Treasury of David, Volume 3, by Charles Spurgeon.